Hi, I'm here to talk about Camus' The Rebel. And in this video, I will simply talk about how I understand it, and apologies if I'm not 100% academically correct or I make certain mistakes in some of the things that I say, but I'm just reading these books and trying to talk about them in a way that makes sense to me. And I took the time to read through The Rebel, but also the myth of Sisyphus, which in a way can be considered to be almost like a prequel to The Rebel. Although, in my opinion, the approaches to the books are somewhat different. Camus uses the myth of Sisyphus as the first step into explaining absurdism, and it's a more theoretical and like a more philosophical work, whereas the Rebel relies on the historical facts and kind of how other authors, philosophers, and even painters perceive rebellion, whether it's metaphysical, physical, personal, practical, however you would like to call it. So I think it's worth mentioning that absurdism is part of existentialism, which has its roots in nihilism. And nihilism is a school of thought which essentially says that the world is indifferent and there is no inherent meaning to the world, right? So the things that happen to you, things that happen to other people, etc., etc. So not nobody is born with a mission in life that they have to achieve no matter what. So there's other authors and philosophers that Camus also mentions in the book, such as Nietzsche, that try to tackle this question. If everything is indifferent, there is no inherent meaning, then on the one hand we have a lot of freedom to do whatever we would like, but at the same time, certain things like suffering can be even more difficult because if there is no inherent meaning to life and I have to suffer, it can almost seem like some of the suffering can be meaningless, but yet I'm still suffering. And so Nietzsche and the other philosophers have tried to tackle this perspective, and they all have their own unique approaches to it. So Nietzsche uses the freedom that nihilism brings to reestablish morals and to also find heroism in people that they can use then to tackle difficulties and grow and go through the becoming as such. Soren Kierkegaard relies heavily on God to put his life in the hands of God and take the leap of faith, almost in an action of fatalism. Max Stirner essentially focuses more on the egoism and how I am the world, and how the world revolves around the big I in a way. And then, of course, there's the other existentialists such as Camus. And Camus, he thinks that essentially, on the one hand, you have a world that is inherently indifferent to our actions. It can be random and chaotic. And then on the other hand, you have the human drive and the desire for meaning and for understanding and using reason to find the answers to the big questions. And when you combine the two, they might not always fit, because there might be certain questions that you, through the circumstance, will never get an answer to, or the question is too big. And in that case, as you go deeper and deeper into the question, simply more questions arise. And so Camus' approach is to say, well, okay, it's kind of absurd that humans have this drive, but then on the other side, the world doesn't really care, and it's kind of absurd. And so what he essentially drives to is to say, well, that's fine, there is no inherent meaning. I am free to create my own meaning in the world, and I am also free to find happiness in the small things and things that bring happiness to me. But also, it's to recognize the absurdity of having the desire for the answers and sometimes not getting them, and that's okay. And so he brings the analogy of Sisyphus, who was condemned to roll the stone up the hill and down the hill, but because he recognizes the absurdity of the situation where he's condemned to do this forever, um, it's kind of absurd, and we must imagine him being happy because he recognizes it. And so with the same way with a lot of the things in life. For example, someone might ask, why do I have to wake up every day and think about the things I do? And maybe there are difficult things that I still need to feel and think about. But it's life itself. Life is like a process that you can start enjoying today, and even though you're rolling the stone up the hill and then it rolls down and things might not work out the way you want to, it's still a process. And if you're already going through it, you might as well imagine yourself being happy. You must imagine Sisyphus being happy. And this book specifically, I think it's fair to say that it's kind of split into two sections. So the first section is where he talks about rebellion, and he brings in the slave master dynamic. And he essentially says that in every human's life there might be a moment where he's had enough with the certain circumstances in life, or the way that he feels currently, or the dynamic of life in general, and he might rebel against it to raise to the same level as the master. Or essentially later on he talks about the metaphysical rebellion, which is a follow-up to the metaphysical suicide. So if the metaphysical suicide in Myth of Sisyphus talks about how we shouldn't delegate the responsibility of things happening in our life to the higher being. It's like a game that we can play that say, oh, it's God wills it, so that's why it's happened. And he says that it's kind of a game that we should stop playing. Then the same way here, he essentially brings the human to the level of the gods, so the human could speak one-to-one with him. And the second part, which I also found to be quite intriguing, is where he goes into the more practical applications of the rebellion, and he tries to tie the philosophy with actual rebels, such as Bakunin, the famous Russian anarchist, who was very practical in his approach in rebellion, and he writes quite extensively on the Russian rebellions, Russian Revolution, but also he mentions the Paris Commune and the French Revolution, of course, as well. So in a way, it's a follow-up to the Myth of Sisyphus, but I found it to be a little bit, quite different. I would say it's tied to more practical and historical things, if you're interested in reading this, I would recommend going through the Myth of Sisyphus first, and also perhaps getting a bit accustomed with authors such as Nietzsche. He talks about Hegel. Hegel can be quite complex. Marx. So things like the Russian Revolution, perhaps the French Revolution, just to have a little bit more context on how on what he talks about, I think could be quite useful as well. And of course, there's other authors that he mentioned here as well, such as Marquis de Sade, which can be quite unique in their approach as well. So if you're interested, you can check them out as well before reading this book.